The cold arrived earlier than usual that year. It was the kind of cold that slipped through thin jackets and stayed in the bones, refusing to leave. The city still looked alive on the surface, traffic lights blinking. People rushing to work, shops opening their doors, but underneath all that movement, some lives were slowly freezing in place near the edge of a crowded street. A woman stood holding two children close to her. She wasn't asking loudly for help. She didn't shout or beg. She just stood there, adjusting the torn sleeve of the older child and wiping the nose of the younger one with a corner of her scarf. The scarf was once bright, maybe red or blue, but time, rain, and dust had taken its color. The children were quiet. Too quiet for their age. The older one looked around with tired eyes, watching people rush past. The younger child leaned against the woman's chest, breathing weakly, shivering under layers that were not warm enough. People noticed them. It wasn't that they were invisible. Many eyes landed on them for a second or two. Some slowed their steps, others frowned, a few even reached into their pockets, but in the end, most walked away. Some thought someone else would help. Some believed the woman was exaggerating or pretending. Others simply did not want their day interrupted. The woman had stopped feeling angry about that part. Hunger had a way of draining emotions. What remained was a heavy tiredness and a quiet fear that grew louder when night came. Earlier that morning, she had tried once again to get help. She had gone to a shelter she had heard about from another woman on the streets. With her children beside her, she waited in line for hours. When it was finally her turn, the worker behind the desk barely looked up. There were no beds left. She was told to come back next week. Next week sounded like a dream. She nodded, thanked the worker, and walked away. Even though every part of her wanted to sit on the floor and cry, the older child asked a question while they walked. "Are we going somewhere warm today?" She hesitated before answering. She hated lies, but the truth hurt more. "Yes," she finally said, her voice soft. "We'll find something." She hoped her tone sounded confident. They tried a local clinic because the younger child had been coughing all night. The waiting room was full. The nurse glanced at them, noticed their clothes, and asked for documents they no longer had. Without papers or money, there was little that could be done. The nurse looked uncomfortable, not cruel, just overwhelmed. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Those words followed the woman all the way back outside. As the day moved on, the city grew louder. Car horns, street vendors calling out, the sounds of life continuing. The children sat on a piece of cardboard near a bus stop, while the woman stood nearby, trying to think. She counted the coins in her pocket again and again, even though she already knew the number wouldn't change. A man in a suit passed by, talking loudly on his phone about meetings and deadlines. A couple walked past laughing, holding warm cups of coffee. A teenager slowed down, looked at the children, then quickly looked away. Time passed differently on the pavement. Minutes stretched. The cold became sharper. The woman remembered a different life. Not wealth, not comfort, just stability. A small room, a routine. Nights where the children slept without coughing. She hadn't imagined she would end up here. No one ever does. By late afternoon, the younger child's breathing became more strained. The woman pressed her forehead against the child's head, feeling heat beneath the cold skin. Fear tightened her chest. She tried to flag down help again, speaking louder now. Desperation creeping into her voice. "Please," she said to anyone who glanced her way. "My child is sick." Some shook their heads. Some said they were late. One person handed her a small bill and hurried off without eye contact. It helped, but not enough. As evening approached, the streetlights flickered on. The temperature dropped again. The woman knew night would be dangerous. Every night had been dangerous lately. She wrapped the children closer and whispered reassuring words. Even though her own hope was beginning to thin, she wondered how many people had passed them that day. Hundreds, maybe thousands. All of them going somewhere? All of them assuming someone else would stop. What she didn't know was that this was the day before everything would change. But for now, no one had helped them in time, and the city kept moving. Unaware that a quiet breaking point had almost been reached, night fell slowly. like it didn't want to take responsibility for what would happen next. The city lights came on one by one, bright and careless, reflecting on wet roads and cold sidewalks. For many people, night meant rest, dinner, warmth. For the woman and the children, it meant another test they were not sure they could pass. They moved from the bus stop when the security guard asked them to leave. He wasn't rude. He just said rules were rules. She didn't argue. Arguing used too much energy. Instead, she guided the children toward a small space between two closed shops where the wind was a little weaker. She laid down the thin blanket she had been carrying and sat the children on it. The older child tried to stay brave, rubbing hands together, pretending it wasn't so bad. The younger one was quieter now, leaning heavily against her arm. "Try to sleep," she whispered. "I'll watch." She had said those words many nights before. Sleep came in short pieces. Every sound made her alert. Footsteps, sirens, laughter from a distance. She kept touching the younger child's forehead, worried about how warm it felt compared to the cold air. Her mind raced with questions she didn't want to answer. Should she wake the child? Should she keep walking? Where could she go? She searched her memory for anyone left to call. A number she had once saved no longer worked. Another person had promised help months ago, but disappeared. Pride used to stop her from asking too often. Now pride was gone. Only urgency remained. At some point during the night, rain began to fall. Light at first, then heavier. She used her own body to block as much as she could, pressing the children close. Her clothes soaked through. Her hands shook, partly from cold, partly from fear. She thought of the word temporary. People had told her this situation was temporary, that things would improve. But temporary had started to feel permanent. Morning came slowly. Gray, quiet, unfriendly. The rain left behind cold air and slippery pavement. The children woke up stiff and hungry. The younger one coughed again, harder this time. The sound scared her. She knew she couldn't stay still anymore. They walked toward a busy area, where people gathered for work early. She hoped that more people would mean more chances. As they walked, the older child lagged behind, tired and sore. "I can't walk fast," the child said. She slowed down, squeezing the child's hand. "It's okay," she said. "We'll take our time." But inside, panic was building. Outside a bakery, warm air spilled out every time the door opened. The smell of bread filled the street. The children stared quietly. She asked the worker if there was any leftover food from yesterday. The worker avoided her eyes and shook his head. She thanked him anyway. A few steps later, someone else handed her half a sandwich, already cold. She thanked them again and broke it into careful pieces so both children could eat. She didn't take a bite herself. As the day passed, her movements became slower. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her. She noticed that the older child was watching her closely now, more aware than before. "Are you tired?" the child asked. She smiled, just a little.
Ow.
The truth was, she felt like she was fading. Not disappearing, but thinning, like there was less of her than there used to be. By midday, the younger child's coughing grew worse. Breathing sounded rough, heavy. Panic pushed her back toward the clinic from the day before. The waiting room was just as crowded. This time, she spoke more firmly, explaining the situation, her voice shaking. The worker sighed. Clearly exhausted. "We really can't do anything without the proper information," she said. Not unkindly. The words landed like a door being closed. She stood there for a moment, hoping somehow the answer would change. It didn't. Outside, she felt the sting of tears but forced herself to swallow them. Crying wouldn't help the children. She sat them down on some steps and tried to think clearly. That was when a volunteer from a small local charity approached. The woman listened carefully, nodding, asking questions. For the first time in days, someone truly listened. But even this help had limits. They offered a meal later that evening and wrote down a list of places to try. "Don't give up," the volunteer said. She nodded, holding on to those words like a thin rope As afternoon turned to evening again, exhaustion hit harder. The older child stumbled once and nearly fell. She caught the child just in time. Fear surged through her. People continued to move around them. Some stared. Some whispered. Many ignored them completely. The city had learned how to step around suffering without slowing down. That night, the cold returned stronger. She held the children, counting their breaths, praying quietly. She wondered how close she was to losing everything. Somewhere across the city, in a place full of light and warmth, a man would soon hear about a family he had never met. But for now, help was still too far away. The waiting continued, and time once again was not on their side. The third morning began with uncertainty. The sky was clear, but the air still carried the cold from the night before. The woman woke before the children, her body stiff and sore. For a moment, she stayed still, listening to their breathing. The older child slept lightly, waking at every sound. The younger one's breathing was shallow and uneven. That frightened her more than anything else. She sat up slowly and pulled the blanket tighter around them. Her mind felt crowded with worry, but she forced herself to think step by step. She needed food. She needed warmth. Most of all, she needed medical help for the younger child. She tried to stand and felt dizzy. She leaned against the wall until the feeling passed. Hunger had become constant, a dull ache that never left. They walked again. Walking was the only thing she knew how to keep doing. The city was fully awake now. Buses roared past. People hurried with purpose, eyes locked on phones or the ground ahead of them. The woman adjusted her pace to match the children's steps. Even though every part of her wanted to rush, by late morning her voice was hoarse from asking for help. Some people showed kindness, a piece of fruit, a few coins. A quiet word, but none of it fixed what was growing worse hour by hour. The older child grew quieter. Sensing the tension, "Is the little one going to be okay?" the child asked softly. She swallowed. "Yes," she said. "We're trying our best." Trying felt like such a small word for what they were doing just to survive. Across the city, in a high building filled with glass and light, a man sat in a meeting room. He was used to being listened to, used to decisions happening quickly when he spoke. The room was calm, professional, controlled. Charts on the wall showed numbers rising, projects moving forward, but his attention drifted. He had not slept well the night before. A short news clip had played while he watched quietly from his living room. It was brief, almost nothing. Just a shot of the streets, a mention of growing homelessness, and then it moved on to something else. But the image stayed with him. Now, as people around the table discussed profits and timelines, he found himself thinking about that clip, about how Isley's suffering could appear and disappear from view. He felt an uncomfortable pressure in his chest. The meeting ended. He dismissed everyone earlier than planned. "Something else on your mind?" An assistant asked carefully. "Yes," he replied. "Too many things." He left the building without his usual protection, without announcements or cameras. He told no one exactly where he was going. He just walked back on the streets. The woman finally reached a public space with benches and shade. She set the children down gently. The younger one was barely responding now. Panic rose fast and sharp. She knelt beside the child, speaking softly, brushing hair back, trying to keep the little one awake. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please." People passed. Some slowed. A few stopped. Most moved on. Her voice broke as she called out for help again, louder than before. She no longer cared who heard her. That was when the man noticed. He was crossing the square. Mind still elsewhere when the sound stopped him. It wasn't the noise itself, but the fear behind it. He turned and saw the woman on the ground with 2 children beside her. For a moment he hesitated. Old habits told him to signal someone else, to let staff handle it, to keep moving. But he didn't. He walked closer. The woman looked up, her eyes wide and tired. She didn't recognize him. To her, he was just another stranger. She spoke quickly, afraid he'd leave. "My child is sick," she said. "I've tried everywhere. Please." He knelt down, ignoring the cold ground, and looked at the younger child. One glance told him this was serious. "Has a doctor seen them?" he asked. She shook her head. "No one would take us." He felt something shift inside him, anger mixed with responsibility. Not anger at her, at the situation, at the idea that this could happen while so much existed around them. He pulled out his phone and made a call. His voice was calm but firm. He gave clear instructions. He stayed there the entire time, holding the woman's attention, asking gentle questions, keeping her focused. When help arrived, fast and efficient, people began to gather. Whispers spread as recognition dawned for some. That recognition didn't matter to him, as the children were taken to safety. The woman held on to the man's sleeve for a moment, tears running freely now. "Thank you," she said again and again. He nodded. "You shouldn't have had to beg," he replied quietly as they left the square. The crowd watched in silence. Some felt relief. Others felt discomfort. Everyone felt something. The man knew this could not end here. Helping one family was necessary, but it was not enough. That realization stayed with him as the city carried on. Unaware that a turning point had just been reached, the hospital room was quiet, except for the steady sound of machines and soft footsteps moving in the hallway. The woman sat close to the bed, afraid to touch the younger child too much, afraid and relieved at the same time. Warmth surrounded them now. Clean sheets, soft light. It felt unreal, like something borrowed that could disappear at any moment. The older child sat on a chair by the window, watching cars move below. For the first time in days, the child wasn't shivering. A doctor came in and spoke calmly, carefully explaining what was happening. The illness had grown worse because of cold and exhaustion, but help had come just in time. With treatment and rest, recovery was possible. The woman covered her mouth, tears slipping through her fingers. Relief washed over her so strongly that her legs felt weak. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure who she was thanking anymore. Across the room, the man listened quietly. He hadn't left since they arrived. He made sure everything was handled before stepping back, giving the family space. He didn't want to overwhelm them or turn their crisis into a moment about himself. Yet his phone didn't stop buzzing. Messages came in fast. Questions, alerts, requests for confirmation. Someone had recognized him at the square. Photos had already spread. People were talking. He turned his phone face down. "What happens now?" the woman asked quietly, her voice shaking despite her effort to stay calm. "Now they heal," he replied. "And then we make sure you're not sent back out there." She nodded, still unsure how much she could believe. Later that day, he walked into a different kind of room. This one had cameras, microphones, people waiting to hear him speak. Normally, these spaces felt ordinary to him, controlled, predictable. Now they felt heavy. He stood before reporters, not dressed to impress, not smiling. He spoke plainly. "I didn't plan this," he said. "I saw a family in trouble and did what anyone should do." A murmur moved through the room. "That family was failed long before I arrived," he continued. "And they're not the only ones." Questions followed quickly. Why did it take someone like him to step in? Was this a one-time act? What about others still on the streets? He didn't dodge the questions. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "We've become comfortable passing responsibility to someone else. Today it happened to be me passing by. Tomorrow it might be no one." The words spread fast. Back at the hospital, the woman watched part of the coverage on a small screen. She didn't fully understand everything he was saying, but she understood the tone. She understood that he was angry for them, and that made her feel less alone. Conversations started everywhere. In offices, on buses, in homes, people argued. Some praised him. Others accused him of seeking attention. But no one could ignore the story. Behind the scenes, he moved quickly. Calls were made, meetings scheduled, old plans reevaluated. He asked questions that made people uncomfortable. How many families are waiting? What happens when shelters are full? Why does help arrive only when tragedy's obvious? Some answers came. Many did not. The woman, meanwhile, stayed by the bedside, slowly relaxing as color returned to the younger child's face. Nurses checked in often. Food arrived regularly. Warm blankets stayed put. At night, she slept sitting up, afraid to let go of the moment. The older child spoke more now, asking questions about school, about what would happen next. Hope crept back carefully, like something shy. One afternoon, the man visited again, this time without the noise around him. He sat across from the woman, listening as she spoke about the months before the streets, about missed chances, about doors that had closed quietly. "I tried," she said. "I really did." "I know," he replied. For the first time, she believed someone. The situation had grown bigger than them now. Officials were responding. Promises were being made. Task forces announced. Some of it felt real. Some felt like words meant to calm the storm. But the man pushed anyway. "It's not enough to rescue," he said in another meeting. "We have to change how people fall." The city felt different during those days. More aware, more divided. Some people felt inspired, others felt exposed. In the hospital room, the weather outside changed again. The sun came through the window, softer this time. The woman held the younger child's hand and breathed deeply. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a future. But she also knew something important. If that man hadn't stopped, if he hadn't knelt down, if he had kept walking like everyone else, this story wouldn't exist. That thought stayed with him. 2. Helping them was the beginning. What came next would decide whether it truly mattered. The days that followed felt slower, calmer, but heavier in a different way. The hospital room no longer felt like a place of fear. It became a place of waiting, of small improvements and quiet conversations. The younger child's breathing became steady. Color returned to tired cheeks. Meals were finished instead of pushed aside. The woman noticed every little change. A deeper breath, a stronger cough that no longer scared her. The way the child slept without shaking. Each moment felt like something precious that could have been lost. The older child began to smile again, not often at first, but enough to notice. The child asked about homework, about books, about normal things that once seemed impossible. "Will I go back to school?" the child asked one morning. The woman paused before answering, then nodded. "Yes," she said softly. Very soon, the words sounded different now. Not like a lie, not like a wish, like a promise she could keep. Arrangements were made quietly. Temporary housing, support services, a path forward that didn't end on a sidewalk. None of it was rushed. The man made sure of that. He checked details most people ignored. Length of stay, privacy, stability. He didn't want this to be another short rescue followed by another return to struggle. As the family prepared to leave the hospital, the woman packed their few belongings carefully. She folded clothes slowly, almost respectfully, as if rushing might break the spell. Before they left, the man stopped by one last time. "You'll have support," he said. "People checking in. You won't be alone in this." She held her children close and looked at him, searching for the right words. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. He shook his head. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Just keep going." Outside, the city felt different, not kinder, not suddenly fair, but familiar in a way it hadn't been before. The woman noticed sidewalks, shops, people, things she'd only seen through fear. They moved into a small place where doors locked and heaters worked. The first night there, the woman sat on the floor after the children fell asleep. She cried quietly, not from sadness but from release. Life didn't become perfect. There were forms to fill out, meetings to attend, questions that felt overwhelming. Some days were still hard. Some nights she lay awake worrying. But the fear was different now. It no longer felt like a countdown. The man watched from a distance as systems reacted. Some changes happened quickly. Extra funding announced. Emergency response plans updated. Other changes moved slower. Tangled in rules and debates, he learned something important during that time. It wasn't lack of resources that It's trapped people most of the time. It was hesitation, passing responsibility, waiting for permission. He spoke about it openly. Help should not depend on luck, he said in one interview, or on who happens to walk by. People listened. Some nodded. Some denied it was that simple. But fewer looked away. Weeks passed. The younger child returned to health completely. Laughter filled the small home in bursts that still surprised the woman. The older child started school again, nervous but proud, carrying borrowed supplies and hope. One evening, the woman stood by the window watching the city lights come on, the same lights that once felt cold and distant. She thought about the day no one helped, and about the moment one person stopped. She knew many others were still out there, still waiting, still hoping someone would notice in time. She couldn't save them all. Neither could he, but she also knew something else. Now, change didn't always start with systems or money or fame. Sometimes it started with stopping, with kneeling down, with listening. The story didn't end with applause or miracles. It ended with breath, with warmth, with a family that almost disappeared, but didn't, and with a question left hanging for anyone willing to hear it. If help arrives only when someone important notices, how many chances are we missing every day? That answer belonged to everyone, and it always would. Life did not pause after hope returned. It moved forward quietly, one ordinary day at a time. The woman learned that stability was not a single moment, but a series of small choices repeated again and again. Each morning, she woke before the children, listening to the steady sound of their breathing. That sound still mattered to her more than anything. She prepared simple meals, helped with school clothes, and walked them to the door with a warmth she had once been afraid to feel. The older child adjusted slowly to school. Some days were easy, some were not. Questions came home along with homework. Questions about where they had been, about why things had changed. The woman answered carefully, protecting what needed protection, telling the truth where she could. She wanted the children to understand without carrying fear. The younger child grew stronger, running ahead on sidewalks, laughing without coughing. Every laugh felt like a reminder of how close things had come to ending differently. Across the city, conversations continued. The story faded from headlines, replaced by newer ones. That was expected. Attention always moved on. But something underneath stayed active. Policies were reviewed, funding paths adjusted. Emergency response teams trained differently. Not perfectly. Not fast enough for everyone, but differently. The man pushed quietly now, away from cameras. He learned quickly that loud promises were easier than lasting work. Meetings became longer. Progress felt slower. Some days resistance was strong. Nothing changes overnight, people reminded him. He knew that. But he also knew nothing changed at all if pressure disappeared. He visited shelters without notice, spoke to workers without scripts, listened to stories that echoed the same patterns. Missed chances, narrow rules, too much waiting. What stayed with him most were the moments people described when no one stopped. He thought about that. Often, meanwhile, the woman began to rebuild more than routine. She found small work with flexible hours. It wasn't easy and it wasn't permanent. But it was something she could step toward without fear of collapse. Each paycheck felt earned, it's not given. She kept in touch with people who had helped not out of obligation, but because connection mattered now. She understood how quickly isolation had once swallowed her. Some evenings, she sat by the window again, watching the city lights, not with distance, but with awareness. She could see how close danger still lived to safety. One afternoon, she received a message from someone still on the streets. A woman she had once shared food with. The message was short and scared. "I don't know where to go." The woman read it twice. She didn't have answers, but she had one thing she hadn't before. She stopped. She replied. Help didn't come as fast as she wanted it to, but it came sooner than before. That mattered. The children noticed changes in her too. She spoke with steadier confidence. She paused instead of panicking. She asked for help without shame one evening. The older child said something that stayed with her. "You don't look scared all the time anymore." She smiled. Neither did they. The story no longer belonged to one moment in a square. It belonged to choices stacking quietly on top of each other. Two people who learned to stop. Two systems learning, slowly, to bend. The man knew he would not be remembered for charts or meetings. That was fine. He didn't want to be remembered at all. He wanted fewer stories like theirs, and more mornings that started with breath, with warmth, with a chance that arrived. Before it was too late, time had a way of testing whether change was real or only temporary. Weeks turned into months, and the rush of attention faded almost completely. What remained were quiet routines and everyday pressures. The kind that didn't make news but decided futures. The woman learned that safety brought its own challenges. Expectations returned. Bills arrived on time. School visits were scheduled. Life no longer waited for her to catch her breath. Some mornings, the weight of it all felt heavy again, but it was a different kind of heaviness. It came with ground beneath her feet. She kept a small notebook now. In it she wrote reminders, numbers, appointments, simple goals. Finish one task. Rest when needed. Ask for help before panic arrived. The children continued to grow into their new days. The older child struggled at school at first. Falling behind had left gaps that couldn't be filled quickly. Some teachers understood. Others spoke carelessly, not knowing the full story. The woman attended meetings, listened quietly, then spoke up when it mattered. "My child is catching up," she said once. "Please give time." Time, she had learned, was everything. The younger child no longer remembered the streets clearly. Cold nights became blurred memories. That alone made the woman both relieved and sad. She wanted her child safe, but she also wanted the lesson remembered somewhere across the city. The man felt the long grind of resistance. The early energy had cooled. People went back to old habits. Meetings stalled. Committees delayed decisions. He was told more than once that progress was being made. Quietly. Quietly was not always enough. He didn't argue the way he once had. He changed tactics. He focused on follow-through, on numbers that represented lives, not headlines. He reminded people of what happened when waiting became a policy. The story resurfaced unexpectedly. One afternoon, when a local program prevented an eviction before it happened, someone mentioned the original case during a small interview. No cameras followed, but staff members felt the connection. "That family could have been us," one of them said. The woman heard about it later from a caseworker. She sat with the thought for a long time. She understood how thin the line was between stability and loss. That night, she spoke to her children honestly. "We have this chance," she said, "and we protect it by paying attention, by helping when we can, even if it's small." The older child nodded seriously. "I won't look away," the child said. Those words stayed with her. One evening, months later, she crossed the same square where everything had changed. She hadn't planned to. It was just on her way home. She stopped at the edge, remembering the cold ground, the fear. The moment everything could have ended, people walked past, just like before. Some hurried. Some laughed. Some stared at their phones. She didn't feel angry. She felt awake. She noticed someone sitting alone nearby, wrapped in thin clothes, hesitating, unsure whether to ask. For help, she didn't have much, but she stopped. She asked a question. The city didn't change in that moment. Traffic kept moving. The world stayed loud, but something important happened anyway. The man would later describe success differently than he once had. Not by how many programs existed, but by how often someone paused. Pausing was not weakness. It was awareness. The woman walked home with her children, their hands warm in hers. Lights turned on in windows around them. Life continued. The story didn't end it. It spread quietly from one stop to another, from one person to the next, and in that quiet movement, in that shared attention, something stronger than help began to grow: responsibility. The city did not announce change when it arrived. There were no sirens, no public countdown, no clear moment when everything became better. Change came quietly. Through ordinary days that slowly began to feel less heavy, the woman learned that healing did not mean forgetting. Some nights she still woke suddenly, heart racing, listening for sounds that no longer belonged in her life. She would sit up, breathe slowly, and remind herself where she was. Then she would walk softly into the children's room and watch them sleep, just to be sure. The children slept deeply now. Their bodies no longer stayed tense through the night. Their dreams seemed lighter, marked by laughter instead of fear. Watching them, the woman understood how close she had come to losing things she could not replace. Mornings became predictable in a way she once thought impossible. Alarms rang. Shoes were found. Backpacks were checked twice. Breakfast was simple, sometimes hurried, sometimes slow. Each routine strengthened something inside her. Stability began to feel earned. The older child grew more confident at school. Grades improved slowly, not perfectly, but honestly. Teachers began to notice effort instead of absence. The child learned to raise a hand again, to speak without fear of being ignored. The younger child discovered joy in movement. Running, jumping, climbing, simple acts that once felt dangerous were now expressions of freedom. The woman watched carefully at first, always ready to protect. Over time, she learned how to let go. Letting go was harder than she expected across the city. The story continued its quiet work. It was no longer talked about on screens or printed in bold letters. Instead, it lived inside policies, training manuals, new procedures that tried to respond faster. Some efforts failed. Others worked surprisingly well. The man remained focused. He didn't expect gratitude. He didn't seek praise. He measured progress in numbers that rarely appeared in speeches. Fewer emergency cases. Faster responses. More space, where space had once been missing. He also faced disappointment. Some people resisted every change. Others pretended change was happening when it wasn't. There were days when even his influence wasn't enough to push things forward. On those days, he remembered the square, the sound of fear in one voice, the weight of a simple decision. That memory kept him steady. The woman reached a point where she no longer introduced herself as someone who had survived the streets. She was something else now. She worked. She planned. She imagined. Still, she did not turn away from the past. One afternoon, she volunteered at a small community space once a week. She helped organize supplies, sorted clothes, made coffee. It wasn't dramatic work, but it mattered. She listened to stories that reminded her of who she might have become if help had arrived later. Or not at all. Listening had changed her. She learned when to speak and when to stay quiet. She learned that looking at someone fully was sometimes the greatest gift. One evening, a woman arrived with tired eyes and shaking hands. The look was familiar. The woman felt something tighten in her chest. She did not promise miracles. She offered time that night. She went home emotionally exhausted but deeply steady. The children noticed. "You helped someone today," the older child said. She nodded. "And you came back," the younger one added. That mattered. The seasons shifted. Cold gave way to mild air. Streets softened. Daylight stayed longer. The city looked different depending on where one stood. The woman often thought about how many stories crossed those same streets at once, some moving towards safety, others drifting closer to the edge. She understood now that awareness did not mean constant fear. It meant attention. Paying attention saved lives. The man spoke less publicly as time went on. Not because he had stopped caring, but because loud words were no longer necessary. He mentored quietly, questioned gently, applied pressure when required. He saw progress, uneven but real. One day, he received a letter. It was short, written by someone he had never met. It described a small moment when help arrived sooner than expected. The letter ended without a name. He kept it anyway. Back at home, the woman prepared dinner while the children worked on homework. The sound of pencils, the smell of food, the ordinary comfort of presence filled the room. She realized she was no longer waiting for something to go wrong. That realization startled her. She had learned to live without constant fear, The past did not disappear. It stayed as knowledge, not as a threat. She carried it with intention. One weekend they visited the square again, not by accident this time. The children asked questions. She answered honestly, but gently. "This is where someone stopped," she said. The children looked around. People passed without noticing. "Do people still need help here?" One asked. "Yes," she replied. "Then why don't more people stop?" She thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes they don't know how," she said. "Sometimes they're afraid. Sometimes they think someone else will." The older child nodded. "I'll stop," the child said. The woman smiled. That night, alone, she allowed herself to feel proud. Not because she had survived, but because she had grown. The story had stretched far beyond its beginning. It was no longer about a moment of rescue. It was about choice, repeated daily. The city continued to move. People hurried. Lights turned on and off. Lives unfolded, but something had shifted. Somewhere between the silence and the noise, between indifference and care. A different rhythm had taken hold. It was slower, it was steadier, and it reminded those who noticed that standing still for one moment could change everything, not because of power, not because of money, but because someone decided not to walk past.